There is a warning that has reportedly been delivered to Prince Andrew, and it is not the kind of warning you brush off. This was not a politely worded suggestion. It was not a quiet nudge from a courtier. According to sources with knowledge of the situation, the message was direct, blunt, and unmistakable. If he continues pushing demands about his current living arrangements and how things are managed around him, he could find himself sleeping in a staff caravan on the Sandringham estate. Let that land for a moment. A man who once lived at Royal Lodge, one of the most enviable private residences in the entire royal estate, is now reportedly being warned that a caravan is not off the table. And the reason this has escalated to this point is not just about a property dispute or a renovation budget. The people who have actually worked around him, in some cases for years, are starting to say what they saw. And what they are describing has a very specific and very consistent shape. So in this video, we are running two threads. The first is what is happening right now with Andrew's housing situation. The second is the long track record that has made this warning feel, to those inside the institution, entirely justified. And those two threads meet in a very specific place. To understand the current situation properly, you need to understand how Andrew got here, because the path from where he was to where he is now is significant. For years, Andrew resided at Royal Lodge, a 30-room property in Windsor Great Park that became closely associated with him and his former wife Sarah Ferguson. It was substantial, it was prestigious, and it gave him a level of comfort and status that reflected the position he once held. But following his withdrawal from public duties, the arrangement around Royal Lodge became increasingly untenable, and eventually a move became unavoidable. From Royal Lodge, Andrew relocated temporarily to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, and from there, the decision was made that Marsh Farm would become his longer-term base. Marsh Farm is considerably smaller. It is less prominent. It does not carry the same weight or visibility as what came before. And by most accounts, it was not what Andrew would have chosen for himself. But here is what is important to understand about Marsh Farm. Before Andrew ever set foot inside it, the property required significant work. This was not a case of freshening up the paint or updating the fixtures. Reports indicated that the renovation involved rewiring throughout the property, plastering work, and at one stage there were concerns raised about asbestos. This was structural preparation. This was the kind of work that takes time and costs real money. And all of that was done before the question of Andrew's personal preferences even entered the equation. A considerable investment was made simply to bring the house to a livable standard. But getting the house ready was only the beginning of the problem. Once Marsh Farm had been prepared, the expectation, at least from those managing the situation, was presumably that Andrew would settle in and accept the new reality. That is not quite what happened. According to reporting from the Mail on Sunday, Andrew continued pushing for changes and additions that went beyond the baseline renovation. And the specifics that emerged are worth examining closely, not just because of their cost, but because of what they say about how Andrew appears to view his circumstances. One detail in particular drew considerable attention. Andrew reportedly insisted on having curtains brought over from Royal Lodge and then altered to fit the windows at Marsh Farm. Now, on the surface that might sound like a minor domestic preference, but think about what that actually involves. You're talking about sourcing specific curtains from a property you no longer occupy, transporting them, having them professionally modified to fit a different space, and bearing the cost of all of that, when the entire context of the move is one of reduction and adjustment. It is not the act of someone who has recalibrated. Then there were the artworks. Pieces were moved from Royal Lodge to Marsh Farm, some of which are reportedly too large for the rooms they have been placed in. The space simply cannot accommodate them properly, and yet they were brought over regardless. The firm Gandon White handled the relocation of these items. Reports placed the cost of the moving team in the region of £15,000. £15,000 for a specialist removal operation, on top of everything else, for a man whose public role no longer exists and whose financial support comes directly from the king's private resources. And it did not stop there. Sources indicated that further upgrade requests were still being pushed even after the move was completed. Additional changes, additional asks, continuing pressure on an arrangement that was never meant to be a like-for-like replacement for what came before. These are not the requests of someone who has genuinely accepted a reduced position. And King Charles III is reportedly very aware of all of it. When Andrew stepped back from royal duties, King Charles made a private financial provision for him. The intention of that arrangement was to give Andrew a degree of stability, a roof over his head, a level of support, without that support being drawn from public funds or involving the kind of formal royal infrastructure that would come with continued public duties. It was, in essence, a private family arrangement, quiet, managed, away from scrutiny. But that arrangement was not designed to be a blank check. And according to sources, the king's patience with what is being described as excessive and unnecessary spending is wearing thin. Those words, excessive and unnecessary, are worth pausing on. They did not come from a tabloid editorial. They reportedly came from sources close to the king himself. And in the carefully managed world of royal communications, language like that does not surface by accident. When people close to Charles are using those specific terms, it signals that the frustration is real, that it has been building, and that it has reached a point where it can no longer be contained entirely behind closed doors. It is also worth considering who Charles is in this context. By most accounts within the institution, he is not a lavish operator. People who have worked alongside him over the years describe someone who takes his responsibilities seriously, who works long hours, and who does not approach his position as a vehicle for personal comfort at others' expense. The contrast with the picture being painted around Andrew could not be much sharper, but the money is only part of the story. What is pulling all of this back into sharper focus is something with a much longer history, and it goes straight to how Andrew treats the people around him. The housing situation is the current flashpoint, but it is not the foundation of the problem. The foundation runs much deeper, and it has been building for a long time. What is re-emerging alongside the Marsh Farm reports is a separate and arguably more serious concern: how Andrew behaves with staff. And this is where the story becomes something more than a dispute about renovation budgets and curtains. Staff accounts matter in this context for a specific reason. These are not political figures with opposing agendas. They are not media personalities with commentary to offer. They are people who worked in direct, day-to-day proximity to Andrew, inside his households, around his schedule, responding to his instructions. Their observations come from the ground level, not from the outside looking in. And what is striking is not that one or two of them have raised concerns. It is that the accounts are consistent across different roles, different time periods, and different professional environments. So let's go through what some of those people have actually said. Vicky Arbiter served as press secretary to the late Queen Elizabeth for over a decade. That is not a peripheral role. That is someone embedded at the very heart of the institution, someone who observed the senior members of the royal family up close, not just in public-facing moments, but in the internal workings of the palace itself. When someone with that level of proximity speaks about a member of the family, it carries a very specific kind of weight. Arbiter has spoken publicly about a number of royals over the years, and the pattern in those accounts is worth noting. When discussing King Charles III, the picture Arbiter paints is of someone defined by his work ethic. Hardworking, focused, often in the office late into the evening. A person who takes the role seriously and approaches it with genuine commitment. That is the baseline. When Arbiter has spoken about Princess Diana, a different kind of warmth comes through. He recalled a birthday celebration that Diana personally organized for him, a thoughtful personal gesture that revealed something about her character beyond the public image. Again, positive. Again, specific. Again, grounded in direct experience. And then the conversation turns to Andrew. The shift in tone is immediate and unmistakable. The measured warmth that characterizes the other accounts simply does not appear. In an interview with the newspaper, Arbiter described Andrew using two words that are hard to misinterpret: arrogant and entitled. Not difficult, not demanding. Arrogant and entitled. That is a specific characterization from someone who, throughout their career, has not been given to careless or inflammatory language about the royal family. But there is something else Arbiter added that is arguably just as revealing. He suggested that the people currently working within palace communications are likely relieved they no longer have to deal with issues surrounding Andrew. Think carefully about what that word, relieved, actually implies. Relief is not a neutral emotion. Relief follows a period of sustained pressure. Relief is what people feel when something that was consistently difficult has finally come to an end. The use of that word suggests that managing the situation around Andrew was not merely a professional challenge. It was a source of ongoing stress for the people in those roles. From someone who spent over a decade at the center of that institution, that is not a casual observation. That kind of language from that kind of source is not accidental. Vicky Arbiter's world was communications and press management, the institutional, reputational side of royal life. Di Davies operated in an entirely different environment. He led royal protection during the 1990s. He was responsible for overseeing hundreds of officers whose sole function was the physical safety of the royal family and senior members of the household. His interactions with the royals were not about image or public narrative. They were operational, day-to-day, often in close quarters and under pressure. When Davies has spoken about King Charles, the picture is consistent with what others have described. Polite, respectful, someone who acknowledged the people around him and treated them accordingly. When Diana comes up, again the account is warm, aligned with the portrait that has emerged from multiple people who worked near her. And then, as with Arbiter, the account changes when Andrew enters the picture. Davies has described Andrew as rude and dismissive, not occasionally difficult. Not demanding in the way that high-pressure environments sometimes produce. Rude and dismissive, as a consistent characterization of how he conducted himself around the officers and personnel responsible for his safety. Now consider the source once more. Royal protection officers are trained professionals. Their job requires a particular kind of discipline, a capacity to observe everything while visibly responding to nothing, to manage complex situations without personal reaction, to keep their opinions private as a matter of professional code. These are not people who speak easily or loosely about the individuals they protect. When someone like Di Davies puts a description like that on the record, it is not a moment of frustration. It is a considered statement from someone who spent years in that environment and has had ample time to reflect on what he witnessed. And here is the thing. Arbiter came from the communications world. Davies came from the protection world. Different departments, different pressures, different types of daily interaction with the royal family. And yet when both of them are asked about their direct experience of Andrew, they arrive at essentially the same place. Two completely different professional worlds. Two completely consistent conclusions. That level of convergence is not coincidence. Arbiter and Davies are named. They have put their observations on the record under their own names. But they are not alone. Running alongside those named accounts is a much broader body of reporting anonymous accounts from household staff, former employees, and people who worked within the orbit of Andrew's various residences over the years. And the texture of those accounts follows the same general shape. High expectations around personal service, a strong emphasis on hierarchy and protocol, but applied in a direction that flowed downward, not upward. Interactions in which staff were made to feel the distance between their position and his very clearly. Environments in which mistakes, even minor ones, were not met with patience. Andrew earned the nickname Air Miles Andy in the earlier part of his public life, largely because of the frequency and cost of his official travel. But within certain institutional circles, there was always a parallel conversation about what he was like when the cameras were not present and the public audience was not watching. A person can project one version of themselves outward while behaving very differently in the rooms where only staff can see them. And the accounts that have accumulated over the years suggest that the gap between those two versions of Andrew was not small. It is worth asking a straightforward question. Where are the counter-accounts? Where are the former household staff who have spoken warmly about working for him, the ones who recall a thoughtful employer, a considerate presence, small gestures of acknowledgement? They exist in abundance for other members of the royal family. For Diana, the accounts are well documented. For Charles, for Anne, even for more peripheral figures, there are people willing to speak positively about their experience. For Andrew, that counter-narrative is conspicuously absent. The silence itself says something. To be fair, and it is worth being precise here, there is a difference between a difficult personality and genuinely harmful behavior. Not every demanding employer crosses a line. Not every reported incident of rudeness represents something that should define a person permanently. But when accounts have accumulated over decades, across different households, from different types of roles, from people who had nothing obvious to gain by speaking, the volume and consistency of those accounts becomes its own form of evidence. Now take all of that history, all of those accounts, all of those years, all of that accumulated picture, and bring it into this specific present moment, because that is exactly where the warning comes in. We opened this video with the warning. Now, with everything else laid out, it is worth returning to it, because it lands very differently with that context behind it. The warning, as it has been reported, was not a formal communication. It was not a letter from a solicitor, not an official statement, not something that will appear in any public record. It was a message delivered privately, through the channels that exist inside institutions like this. The kind of message that does not need to be put in writing, because the people involved understand exactly what it means. And what it reportedly said was this: if Andrew continues pushing demands around his living arrangements and continues behaving in the manner that has been described around staff, the people managing his situation are not obligated to continue accommodating him in the way they currently are. The staff caravan reference, which is how this detail has been characterized in reporting, is not simply a colorful metaphor. It is a signal. A signal that the baseline expectation of comfort that Andrew appears to operate from is no longer being treated as fixed. It is no longer being assumed that his preferences will be accommodated and his requests will be managed. There are limits, and those limits are now, reportedly, being communicated directly to him. The indication from sources is that the message carries endorsement from above the level of estate management, which, in the context of the Sandringham estate, points in a very specific direction. Buckingham Palace, as of the time of reporting, has declined to comment. It is important to understand what that typically means in this context. It does not confirm the reporting, but it also does not deny it. A palace willing to push back on inaccurate reporting about a senior figure tends to say so. Declining to comment occupies a different space, one that neither validates the story nor attempts to dismantle it. There is genuine uncertainty here. We do not have full details. Sources operate with their own perspectives and limitations. Some of the framing may be shaped by interests we cannot fully see. That is worth acknowledging. But this type of story, specifically this pattern, has consistently proven directionally accurate over time. This is not the first time a message like this has reportedly been sent to Andrew, but it may be the most pointed one yet. To fully appreciate what is at stake here, it is worth being precise about where Andrew actually stands within the royal family right now, because the gap between where he was and where he is today is considerable. Andrew is no longer a working royal. That is not a description of a temporary state. It is the current reality. He does not carry out engagements on behalf of the crown. He does not represent the monarchy at official events. He does not hold the kind of active role that would come with institutional support, a formal household, or a public-facing team. That entire infrastructure has been removed. His military titles and honorary patronages, positions he held for decades, and that formed a significant part of his public identity, were relinquished following his association with Jeffrey Epstein and the civil case that followed in the United States. Andrew has consistently denied any wrongdoing in relation to those allegations, and there are aspects of the broader situation that remain disputed, but the impact on his formal position has been definitive. Those titles did not return. What the Sandringham arrangement represents, then, is King Charles's attempt to manage the situation with a degree of private discretion. Rather than allowing it to become an ongoing public issue, Charles has provided a place for Andrew to live and a level of financial support, outside the formal royal structure, handled privately. It is, in effect, a managed accommodation, one that depends entirely on Charles's continued willingness to maintain it. And that is the part that matters most in the current context. Andrew still has a home, he still has financial support, he still maintains proximity to his family, but none of that is guaranteed in perpetuity. None of it is enshrined in anything that Andrew can point to as fixed. It all rests on a private arrangement that, by definition, can be altered. The leverage in this situation does not rest with him. And the behavior being described suggests he may not have fully absorbed that reality. What is bearing down on Andrew right now is not one type of pressure. It is two, and they are working simultaneously, reinforcing each other in ways that are difficult to manage from his current position. The first is internal. Charles's patience with the financial demands being made is, according to sources, running low. The people managing the Sandringham estate are evidently no longer treating Andrew's expectations as automatically reasonable, and the fact that staff accounts are resurfacing in this moment suggests that there are people within that environment who are no longer inclined toward silence. That internal pressure has a ceiling, and based on the reporting, Andrew appears to be approaching it. The second is reputational. Andrew has no public platform from which to respond. He does not give interviews. He does not issue statements that land with any institutional weight behind them. He cannot shape the narrative around himself the way a working royal might be able to. So when stories like this emerge, former staff speaking out, sources describing private warnings, reports of renovation excesses, he has no effective mechanism for pushing back. The palace's silence means that the story occupies the space without challenge. And here is the compounding effect that is easy to underestimate. In isolation, a story about Curtin seems trivial. In isolation, an account of someone being rude to staff is unpleasant but not earth-shattering. But place them together, against the full backdrop of everything that has happened over the past several years, and what emerges is not a trivial picture. It is a consistent, detailed, multi-source portrait of someone whose behavior has not shifted despite everything that has changed around him. The palace does not need to issue a statement for this to matter. The pattern speaks clearly enough. So where does this go? There are a few realistic directions this situation could move in, and they are worth considering honestly. The first scenario is that Andrew adjusts, that the warning lands, that it is taken seriously, that his approach to the people around him and the demands he places on his situation changes in a meaningful way. It is possible. But looking at the long arc of what has been described, across decades, across different households, from multiple different sources, the track record does not make this the most likely outcome. People whose behavior has been consistently described in the same terms across that span of time very rarely change in response to private messaging. Possible, but it requires a level of self-awareness that the available evidence does not particularly support. The second scenario is that things continue in the current uneasy tension. Andrew remains at Marsh Farm. The demands continue at a lower volume. Charles continues to provide support, however grudgingly. The stories periodically resurface. Nothing fully breaks, but nothing fully resolves. This is probably the most likely near-term outcome, an uncomfortable equilibrium that holds because no single incident is quite severe enough to force a definitive break. The third scenario is escalation. And this is where the staff caravan detail stops being a rhetorical device and becomes something more literal. If Andrew's behavior were to create a situation serious enough that the private arrangement became genuinely untenable, whether through financial demands that exceed what Charles is willing to meet, or through incidents involving staff that could not be absorbed quietly. Then the question of what happens to the Sandringham arrangement becomes a real one. There is also a broader context that complicates everything. King Charles's health has been the subject of public attention in recent months. Questions about long-term planning, about what the institution looks like in the years ahead, are not abstract. Andrew's future depends significantly on Charles's continued capacity and willingness to maintain the current arrangement, and that is not guaranteed either. Whether any of this ever becomes fully public, or whether it continues to play out entirely behind closed doors, is itself uncertain. But based on everything we have seen so far, the idea that it simply fades quietly into the background seems unlikely. So here is the question at the center of all of this. Do warnings like this actually change anything when it comes to Andrew? Does a private message, however bluntly delivered, alter a pattern of behavior that has been documented across decades and described by people from completely different professional worlds in almost identical terms? Or does this become another chapter in a longer story that keeps repeating itself behind closed doors? That is genuinely unclear, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this situation worth watching closely. Let me know what you think in the comments. This is one of those situations where we are only ever seeing fragments of what is actually happening, and the parts we cannot see are often the most significant. If you want to stay across this story as it continues to develop, make sure you are subscribed, because this is not the last time we will be talking about it.